Welcome to On the Ballot with Ballotpedia, where we connect people to politics by providing neutral, nonpartisan, and reliable information on our government, how it works, and where it's headed. I'm Jeff Collette, and thanks for being with us. Okay, today I'm joined by Thomas Groban for a quick look at a pretty unique election that happened earlier this week in Vernon, Indiana. Thomas is one of our lead researchers on our local elections team. And one of my favorite parts of all that coverage is really digging into the unique stories that we find in trying to cover the 585,000, that's right, 585,000 elected officials in the country. Thomas is part of our team that helps dig into all that data. And we had a pretty fun story come out of Vernon, Indiana this week that we thought we'd share with all of you listeners. So let's get right to it. Thomas, thanks for coming on the show. Thomas, thanks so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, this is going to be really fun. Okay, so Vernon, Indiana. Okay, this is a small town, population of 300. They held an election on Monday this week. Not Tuesday, Monday. And it happened to be the only regularly scheduled election in Indiana this year. And that doesn't happen often, does it?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. So when it comes to local elections and when they happen, we're looking at two broad categories. The first is that a state might have a consolidated election calendar. This means there are specific dates when local elections happen. The second category would be the state leaving it up to the localities themselves. So there might be some rules in this scenario, but the localities are given broad leeway to schedule their elections as they see fit. So for Indiana, for the most part, they have a very consolidated local election calendar, with Vernon actually being the unique outlier. The reason for this is because Vernon is the only town in Indiana still governed by a charter, which was enacted in 1851 rather than state election law.
Right. Okay. So that's really interesting. And just to give a couple more examples that I remember that we've talked about a little on the show. So in Florida, for instance, they have a state statute that dictates exactly when their, say, school board elections are held. They have to be held by statute on certain Tuesdays in August and even years. Texas, on the other hand, we know from our experience, well, technically school boards themselves can call their own election if they so choose to. So it's pretty it's called control kind of at the local level, like you're saying. So those are a couple of examples. Am I getting that distinction right there?
No, that sounds exactly right. And I mean, there are states where localities and certain local districts are given
Hmm.
an enormous amount of freedom when they can schedule these elections.
Okay, so let's talk about Vernon then. Is this like a free for all? How does the charter make their jurisdiction laws different from the state law in Indiana?
Yeah. So in this case, you can think of a charter as a sort of a constitution for a town. It sets the general rules of the road over how that town operates and how it's governed. There were a lot of these charters in Indiana in the 19th century, not just for towns, but for churches and for businesses as well. But these all were reined in by the state with the statehood constitution in 1851. This allowed towns to start relinquishing their charters. By the 1990s, all towns had done so except for Vernon, Indiana. So the way it works, I mean, if you're like in Gary, Indiana, for example, when it comes to their elections, this is going to be governed by state law. Very predictable. It's the same as everyone else in Indiana. But for Vernon, when these elections happen, the opening and closing of the polls, the offices on the ballot, things like that, these are all governed by town charter.
And we see these kind of unique stories across the country with the sort of local decentralized system. And this wouldn't typically be something that we cover necessarily, but why is it that Vernon has sort of been a holdout? Do you come across any stories like that that said, oh, here's the history of why Vernon, doesn't want to convert to state charter, or here's why they feel really proud to have their own city charter, and they sort of have stuck with it while all the rest of jurisdictions in Indiana have gone, sort of the way of the state constitution, so to speak. Uh, can you share any insight on that?
Doug and I have been communicating with J. Bradley King, who's a co-director of Indiana elections, and it There does seem to be, I would say, some pride in Vernon about how they run their elections and how they administer them. Um,
This reminds me of that story in New Hampshire about that town that has like 6 people that votes at midnight on election day because they want to be the first jurisdiction to cast their vote in the presidential election. It's sort of like that, yeah. So that makes sense. Okay, so now from what I understand, it's not just the fact that they have a unique date for their election, but they actually have kind of an atypical system for how they govern their election. So how did the election work this past Monday when the voters of Vernon, Indiana, went to the polls?
yeah, so observing an election in Vernon is like taking a journey through time, and that's a quote from the Indiana co-director of elections. The polls are actually opened by the loud ringing of a handheld bell. In the past, this has been performed by, like, a prominent person, and
Oh, interesting.
voters
Okay.
cast their ballots on handwritten and hand-counted pieces of paper, and they deposit them in an old wooden ballot box. There's this interesting system, that by tradition, candidates can declare themselves as running for the Citizens Party. This is not a legal distinction, it is a traditional, distinction. The polls close at 4 PM, right? Very early. And then after that, the ballot box is opened and counted in the presence of anyone who wants to view this canvas. So the way these elections are run is definitely kind of a blast from the past.
Yeah, this reminds me it kinda reminds of the pomp and circumstance around Puxatawney Phil in Pennsylvania, who, by the way, has brought way too much winter this year. He was right, he saw his shadow. It's been a cold one. So, what are some other unique stories like this one? So, you've covered local elections and, dozens of states across the country, tens of thousands of different elections. Any other kinda quirky or unique parts of our political system that kinda really stand out to you, that might be, fun to remember?
There are, I would say, especially some unique circumstances governing local elections on the East Coast. We see in Maine, for instance, towns are given absolute freedom as to when they can schedule their elections. So we have covered elections happening on Saturdays, elections happening in a town in April when it's the only town in the entire state that has an election in April.
And a lot of that northeastern, sort of towns and villages stuff, it really just dates back to the colonial versions of their state constitutions. The northeastern, or you can call it the colonial states, have different sets of constitutions and rules and charters for cities. So we kinda see that it dates back to those historical data points. Is that about right?
Yeah, absolutely. And we also see some very unique office names in these places too that do, I think, harken back to a sort of a previous colonial political system.
Oh, what are some examples?
Yeah, so like a warrant committee and things like that, and the planning board and just these
Is the warrant committee something where you elect people who hand out the warrants to the police?
potentially. I don't know exactly, but there are some unique offices, and yeah,
Yeah, well, we are going to be digging into tens of thousands of more elections this year because despite the fact that it is an odd year and most statewide elections are pretty quiet, there are quite a few local elections in particular coming up in Illinois. So I know you got to get back to work crunching through all of those candidates and files we've received. We have a litany of information on Ballotpedia.org about charter cities and home rule, and you can learn more about all of that in our show notes. We'll have that link made available. Thomas, great to have you on the show today.
yep. Thanks for having me.
If you made it this far, great. Hope you really enjoyed learning about the quirks of the American political system. And if you've made it this far through the whole episode, maybe you can share some information and insight with us about what makes this episode so interesting to you. What do you like learning about our political system? You can email us at ontheballot@ballotpedia.org or send us a message on social media. We'd love to hear from you. Thanks for listening. You can learn more about our elections coverage at the link in our show notes. We'll be back next week with another episode. Make sure you subscribe to On the Ballot wherever you listen to podcasts. I'm Jeff Palais, and thanks for listening.